Fascinatingly, both Phyllis Lambert and Ada Louise Huxtable, we might say, came of age architecturally very much in support of Mies van der Rohe. Everyone knows that very immediately about Phyllis Lambert, the famous story of her intervening with her father to demand that a much better and finer and meaningful project be chosen for building a new skyscraper, one of the first new skyscrapers after the war in New York, some beginning of the transformation of the physiognomy of Park Avenue north of Grand Central Station, when Phyllis Lambert famously critiqued the project of her father in a very harshly written letter, and then served to really interview the whole field of architects, aided by Philip Johnson, who had returned to the Museum of Modern Art as curator of architecture and design, played a vital role not only in selecting finally Mies van der Rohe for the project of the Seagram building with its plaza, which became a prototype of a new idea of thinking of how to build inside the Manhattan grid. But equally then, Philip Johnson would himself be involved in the project, working on the Four Seasons restaurant. So the whole creation of the Seagrams, which Phyllis Lambert then later recounted in a kind of memoir historical book many years later, was her introduction to architecture. Coincidentally, I suppose one could say, similarly for Ada Louise Huxtable, who I think for most people is best known as the first architectural critic of the New York Times, probably the first architectural critic in any, at least U.S. American newspaper, full-time architecture critic. But this comes some years after her exposure to architecture, which took place in the confines of the Museum of Modern Art, where she was a curatorial assistant under the direction of Philip Johnson. And in fact, one of her earliest tasks there was to write the text labels for a monographic exhibition, the first ever of Mies van der Rohe. So because she was a woman, she was also asked to go in and clean the exhibition in the morning. And she told me many years later that when the House in the Garden by Marcel Breuer was built, it was her job to get the house cleaned in the morning before the visitors started to come in. So one sees the conditions, I think, in the 1940s, 1950s, particularly the 1940s, when she was at the Museum of Modern Art for being a woman curator. But that was an extraordinary coincidence between Phyllis Lambert's coming into architecture through her appreciation of very strong personality, but also the strong architectural language, the strong commitment to architecture, her sense of excitement that Mies van der Rohe represented something fundamental about architecture, and Ada Louise Huxtable actually serving, in a sense, as the spokesperson for Mies by translating his thought into the text that accompanied that 1947 exhibition, in which she wrote this absolutely wonderful line about the exhibition, saying, "This exhibition is not only about Mies van der Rohe's architecture, it is a work of architecture by Mies van der Rohe," because he was the exhibition designer. And I think from the first, they saw in Mies van der Rohe not simply an architectural project, but an urban project. And they followed both its tenets and then the critiques of it that began to emerge. I think it's interesting to perhaps postulate that both Ada Louise Huxtable and Phyllis Lambert would very early on see no contradiction between an embrace of the modernization of the city, of a strong modernist idiom in architecture, and the preservation often of precisely those buildings that the early modernists had polemically critiqued as being traditional, being stuck in the academic culture of the late 19th, early 20th century. For them, there was no contradiction in this. I admire them greatly, I think. And I think both of them understood preservation not as collecting objects, but as holding on to those elements of a city that would be rich by its palimpsest of different periods, of different approaches to the creation of public space. For them also, I think preservation and the public went hand in hand. They were both defenders early on of the idea of a public engagement in the creation of the city. And this meant not only public spaces, but also a place for the public voice. both Phyllis Lambert and Ada Louise Huxtable, and perhaps even Guy Olenti, I think were such strong personalities that perhaps they didn't engage a great deal in reflection on what we might call the sisterhood. I don't have the impression that they thought of themselves as carving out a place for women and a voice for women, so much as simply asserting their own self-confidence. Obviously, Ada Louise Huxtable comes from a less privileged background than Phyllis Lambert. Phyllis had, in fact, obviously never issues of money, even if she was always a bit of a renegade vis-a-vis what her family might have expected her to do. So she had that built-in, let's say, confidence cushion. But Ada Louise had it as well in the form of powerful institutions that Philip Johnson had full confidence in her and allowed her to do things, even if her voice was not always signed at the Museum of Modern Art, but already her association with the Museum of Modern Art put her very much at the center of establishment culture. So there is one of the institutions by which the modern movement had become an establishment force. And the move from, not directly, but relatively quickly from the Museum of Modern Art to the New York Times, undoubtedly the most powerful print press organ in the United States, and therefore also to be a name that was known beyond the borders, not only of New York, but beyond the borders of the United States. This gave her a position of power that I think meant perhaps that there was no need to think about the battle for the right role for women as equal partners in creating culture and creating cities and creating the things that they fought for. So I don't think that today what the architecture critic of the New York Times or what the curator at the Museum of Modern Art have to say has nearly the power that it did in a world where there was a much clearer notion, a much clearer hierarchy of institutions and of platforms in much of the second half of the 20th century. So I think those powerful voices were also connected to powerful institutions, whether they were existing ones like MoMA or the New York Times, or whether, remarkably, Phyllis creating a powerful institution, which in some ways I think has more resonance outside of Montreal, unhappily, than it does in Montreal itself.